Do you ever feel like the world is going crazy around you? War, political polarization, cultural clashes, exploitation, all fed to your brain through a steady stream of addictive social media posts. In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers Podcast, we're going to discuss this modern predicament and how one might maintain their sanity in this increasingly insane world that we live in. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. A few announcements before we get into the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, check out the courses we offer here at Numinus by clicking on the link in the show notes or going directly to numinus.com/training. You can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work Numinus does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, maybe even share the episode with somebody you think might enjoy it. Without further ado, here's today's episode on staying sane in an insane world. So, Reid, full disclosure, I've been feeling a little insane lately. I've been feeling a little discombobulated and stressed out lately with just the state of the world. We're recording this in the summer of 2024. We're in sort of the embroiled midst of the presidential election coming up. There's a lot of wild, wacky things going on the planet. And I noticed it was taking a toll on my nervous system.
You're not alone.
I don't think I am. Yeah, I don't think I am. And I was noticing the other day, I was doing what has been referred to as doom scrolling. Just scrolling through social media, completely losing track of time, being exposed probably to more information than the human psyche was wired or designed to consume, right? We have access to the world's problems, or at least the problems that get amplified, and just feeling kind of like, discouraged by it all. And so I thought we might explore that in an episode, how to stay sane in a world that feels like it's losing its mind.
Yeah, we are certainly all connected as humans on this planet, and in times of stress, there are ripple effects for sure. It's even borne out in the literature. Even doom scrolling has been looked at, like more in the literature on the negative effects of viewing the news in general, but more recently, with how sticky social media is and how much time, especially young generations, spend on it, it becomes very relevant. But the thing that I draw from those is just a very kind of real confirmation that this negative news, if you view it excessively, it starts to show up in the lenses you take with you around the world and start seeing the world with more of a fearful lens or negative lens, perhaps.
Yeah, it creates this perspective, this, like you say, lens that you view the world through, and it's likely a very biased perspective. We're going to talk about some of the ways in which that bias gets influenced. But one thing I do want to point out about social media today and the way we consume news today is this concept we've talked about before, that I think it's Tristan Harris talks about, this idea of the race to the bottom of the brainstem, and that these apps and these online platforms are designed to keep your eyes glued to them. And one of the ways they do that is by freaking you out or making you angry. Making you feel like that everyone out there is your enemy and you need to stay in your silo and team up and fight the enemy. I remember hearing one person, they claimed they were the ones that designed the infinite scroll feature. Like Facebook back in the day, you get to the bottom of your feed and that would just be it. But now you can
click next.
Yeah, you have to click next. You have to refresh. But that now you have this variable reinforcement news anger slot machine that is just giving you more and more and more, and it's infinite. And so when you have a platform that its income strategy is to keep your eyes glued, then it's not your friend, and it's partly responsible for how we get hooked on this really, really unhealthy media source.
Yeah, and it's different these days. Like if there were tsunami 100 years ago. You might read about it in a newspaper later, right? But if it happens now, it's immediately on in living color, Twitter, and all sorts of other places where you can see it in graphic detail.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's not only access like you're describing, but it's this algorithmically based access that it does what I just described, like keeping your eyes glued, but it also can create what people call like silos or echo chambers, where it's feeding you more of what you're watching and what you respond to. So that's part of what colors the lens, like you were saying earlier.
You know, what's interesting in that is, because we can all relate, we see it happening in our feeds, right? I think we were even doing that last night when we were hanging out, like everyone opened their Instagram feed to see what the theme was on their Explore page, which is kind of funny. And it is a reflection of what you've been clicking on. But back to the literature and research on like negative news viewing, your initial reaction is kind of a predictor of how likely you are to engage in excessive doom scrolling and a predictor of potential negative impact. So it's almost this self-perpetuating, troubling cycle that, and you can use this a little bit practically and see, like, if I had a strong reaction to this news, like I may want to take a note of the fact that I'm more at risk for just scrolling and scrolling through more and more on it. And that is very likely going to take a negative toll on my mental health.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you're talking about bringing some mindfulness to your
pretty
scrolling.
much.
And we're going to talk more about some things that maybe we can do to inoculate ourselves against some of this stuff, mindfulness being one of the top things. But I was just thinking, like, what is it about our psychology that makes us particularly vulnerable to this stuff? I mean, certainly we talked about how the things that frighten us, things that make us angry are more sticky for us. But our tendency toward groupthink, our tendency toward confirmation bias, like looking for information that confirms what we already believe, I think puts us at risk of getting into these silos that we were talking about. Our tendency to be tribal or, to think that people who are unlike us, pick your variable, ideologically, culturally, racially, whatever, are dangerous. And so we need to retreat to these small groups of people who are more like us. And then, like I was referring to earlier, we other the other and make them the enemy. You see that no more clearly than in political discourse now, where you have people on even calling it one side of the aisle, right? Implying these two different teams, ideologically different, just attacking each other, demonizing each other.
Yeah, it is really a wild time for sure. Troubling. And so I love this topic of how to stay sane in an insane world, because I think we all definitely need that in times like this, because I think it's really touched into all that primal machinery, how we're evolutionarily wired. Like you mentioned the bottom of the brainstem stuff, and it's true. In times of chaos, there's a natural stance we're going to take to be extra on guard for potential harmful influences and things, and those things that touch our fear buttons from the algorithms, from the news in general. They really touch a vulnerable spot and might send us spiraling. There's this spectrum we're all on somewhere of catastrophizing, and especially if you're more likely to, assume the worst, assume that this kind of scary or violent or harmful thing is likely to hit close to home, then it'll be extra troubling.
Yeah. And catastrophizing is, a so-called cognitive distortion that is especially noxious when we turn something that isn't necessarily catastrophic into something that is catastrophic, or something, like you're saying, isn't likely to affect us directly into something that is likely to affect us directly. And we live, I've heard this said on social media lots of times, like, we live in unprecedented times. Can we please get a dose of precedented times? Like, can we stop having unprecedented, heretofore never seen events, because it's just stressing us out. But yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it feels like we're in a reality TV show these days.
Yeah, I've even
because
heard
we
people
are.
say that, like, what's happening on season 2 of the political debate, or let's tune in for this reality show that is life.
Yeah, and the deeper you go on it, the more you'll find people spilling their distress in the streets, in the comment threads of every news article, and the discussion forums and social media, of course, including conspiracy theories,
Right.
which which show up even more in times of stress or turmoil.
Yeah, I think let's talk about that for a minute. Like, what makes us prone to get really curious about or believe in so-called conspiracy theories in times of stress and ambiguity? We want the answers, right? And it can be appealing to believe that something that as chaotic as, an assassination attempt on a former president, for example, was orchestrated by this secret cabal of people who have control that we can blame all of our problems on, rather than say there's just chaos and entropy in the world, and that some of it's uncontrollable and absolutely unpredictable. That puts us in an existential spot that is very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it makes us want to find answers where maybe answers don't actually exist.
No, it makes sense. We have this fundamental desire to make sense of things, especially threats, and to control what we can in times of chaos. And this machinery we have certainly can run amok. And because we're also prone to these thinking biases, and the first logical potential explanation, even if, far-fetched or entirely inaccurate, even if damaging, sometimes can be really easy for a mind in times of fear to latch onto.
Yeah. And I think our minds in a time of fear want to latch on to something that gives us some certainty. And one of the things that's particularly sexy about conspiracy theories is this idea of hidden knowledge. Like, I know, and this small group of people, we know that the earth is actually flat, and all you round earthers are idiots. And if only you knew what we knew. And then there's that sort of what I was talking about before, the tribalism or the groupthink, that creates almost a religion out of some of these ideologies, these conspiracy ideologies.
And you can see where it all stems from if you trace it way back to times of tribes and things. But in these unprecedented times where it seems like change is happening at the most rapid pace, more than we could imagine, societal change and upheaval, it's the conspiracy theories are spilling out on the streets big time. And this showed up in spikes in times in the past too. Like before our time, there was one around one of the world wars, for example, or, in times of like the industrial age, times of rapid change was another one where there was a spike of conspiratorial thinking. But, what I find interesting is from this survey that I saw recently, more than a quarter of the population in the U.S. believes that there are conspiracies behind many things in the world. And so it's not like, we're talking about that select extreme group. We're just talking about something that we are all at risk for and need to just, have some conversations about and some understanding and compassion for, because it does show up in times of stress and suffering.
Yeah. And I think in that compassion, we could also say that some theories that are labeled conspiracy theories end up being true. Like sometimes
That's
they end
the
up
tricky part,
right? Sometimes there's a shred of truth in a conspiracy theory that is unverifiable, that makes it sticky. But sometimes we find out that the thing that most people criticize as a conspiracy theory ends up being true. So not trying to crap all over all conspiracy theorists. And a general distrust of authority also makes a person, I think, more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, and I have compassion for that. This is just my opinion, folks, but I think, like, for example, most politicians are habitually dishonest. And it's hard for me to trust people who really, really want power and authority over others. Yeah. So I get it.
And that does match up with like the social science literature of like conspiratorial thinking shows up more commonly, often more prevalent in like low trust cultures and societies than otherwise. And it also makes sense.
Yeah. And a lot of those cultures have good reason to not trust authority, right?
And on the flip side, there are some really damaging examples of conspiracy theory thinking, like even some shootings in the last several years that get traced to someone who's latched on to some kind of delusional idea, if you will, and gone to very scary, damaging lengths with it.
Yeah, it can lead to violence. It can lead to hesitancy to believe in things that could be really, really helpful for the population at large. I'm thinking stuff like vaccines and medical treatments, of course. Not that we want to go down the vaccine denial rabbit hole, but yeah, just more examples of how believing in conspiracies can be damaging.
We'll stick with the flat earther debate. Climate change denialism, perhaps.
Right.
But it's all a hot mess these days. But, you know, I'm remembering this book I read back in the day that has a fun title, The Two Christs of Ypsilanti.
Oh, yeah. I remember hearing talk about this.
Is about these two Jesuses that show up on the psych ward. For some reason, I want to say Jesus. It just sounds cool.
The plural of Jesus.
Dueling Jesus. On like a psych ward.
Like octopi.
And so who is the real Jesus? You know, and, but that is the classic kind of, it doesn't seem to be a challenge most of the time in the real world, but the classic dilemma when you're working on a psych ward or in an environment with a lot of people with psychosis is, how do you know that what they're saying is a delusion or not?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's usually other things that go along with it, but this is, you know, conspiracy thinking, you know, I believe is, you could plot on that spectrum somewhere. And I'm saying that with the acknowledgement that we are all susceptible to that. You know,
absolutely.
And we're all on this spectrum somewhere.
Yeah, I certainly no longer believe in some things that I used to just take as fact at face value. And for some reason that, I don't remember what movie it was, but there's Will Ferrell plays a character where he screams, "I feel like I'm taking crazy pills." Sometimes I feel that way when I've reflected on how my mind has changed. On that point about changing one's mind, got a couple of quotes here. This one's from Ralph Waldo Emerson. "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines." I love that. The hobgoblin of little minds. A foolish consistency, right? Being a mind that is resistant to being updated with good information and good data.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. I think it's funny how Ralph put it. Little mind seems a little belittling.
It is a little belittling. I just love the use of the word hobgoblin. It just sounds hilarious.
And good for him. Sometimes you got to call it out bluntly.
Cold water in the face. Another one, to your point about compassion. This is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility." And that was going to be one of my sort of recommendations for how to feel a little bit more sane, especially if what's making you feel a little disoriented and distressed is arguing with family members or people online. So try to have some empathy and put your mind in their shoes. And this is a bizarre mixed metaphor, but what might it have been in their life?
Put your mind in their shoes. I like it. I'm following though. I'm there.
What if you were born to who they were born to, where they were born, at the time they were born? You might be exposed to similar things that resulted in similar beliefs, right?
I love that. And I had a mentor back in the day, a psychologist who would open his patient visits with this question of like, tell me what it's like to be you, or like, help me understand that. And his whole stance was just inviting that kind of understanding. And I loved it. And it was just really, really game changing for me to see that and how it played out. And I think that stance is needed, especially in times like this, especially around the dinner table with friends and family, or sitting in any setting, hearing these different perspectives, because the perspectives can be wildly different these days, and they might hit certain buttons in you in times like this.
Yeah. The dinner table conversation is a good example, because I think the empathy that we're talking about can act as a solvent to the tension, and it can open up the person on the other side of the table a little bit, especially if you are using I statements to describe how you feel and what you believe, as opposed to accusations and ad hominem attacks. And
there is a desire to, of course, understandably, in ourselves change the mind of another if we think they're misguided, but that's also an uncontrollable that we can and probably should in most cases let go of, the need to try and convince them of something. And it goes along with that stance of, like, empathetic abiding presence and witnessing, and with all sorts of curiosity of what it's like to be the other. Could be hard for us to fathom, or it could be just, I think it's totally far-fetched, but it's that seeking first to understand, not trying to change the other, and just holding their stuff as much as you can with like a boundless heart.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean, a boundless heart doesn't necessarily mean diffuse boundaries either.
Yeah.
If somebody's talking at you and you don't want to be in that conversation, you could say no. You could not participate in that conversation. But I take your point, to be compassionate and open.
You just ruined my boundless heart metaphor forever.
Squashed it.
The part without boundaries isn't what I meant. Just kidding. No, it's a really good point. Like, I love a paradox like this of just how do you hold. I mean, like Ram Dass speaks of it in Paradox when he says the smile of unbearable compassion that you bear. Yeah.
It's not easy. Another sort of concept that I think helps with this is, I think, referred to as Hanlon's razor. You've heard of Occam's razor, which is, the simplest explanation is usually the one that's true. Hanlon's razor, I think, is something like, don't attribute to malice what could be explained by incompetence or ignorance. Ignorance I like better than incompetence, but someone who's ignorant, it just isn't informed, or they don't have access to the same information or data that you do. And so you might think it's malice, you might think it's cruelty, and it might be, but it might not be.
No, everyone is trying their best to make sense of life, with everything they've been through and how they're uniquely wired. And so I think it's a really good point of not assuming someone is wrong, bad, trying to cause harm because they might believe something totally different than you.
Yeah. There's a mindfulness meditation exercise that's well known called the metta practice. Yeah. That can be a good exercise to do when you're trying to get in touch with this compassion for humanity.
I love that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's sometimes referred to as the loving kindness meditation, and done in different ways. But I think the gist of it is, you get in your meditative posture, you breathe, focus on your breath, and then you imagine, I always forget the steps. So you imagine a loved one, somebody who's easy to love, and you picture them in your mind, and you send them loving kindness phrases like, may you be well, may you live with ease, may you be happy. You sort of marinate on that for a while, and then you might switch to yourself, try to give. And if that's hard, imagine yourself as a child and send your child self that love. And then you might switch to somebody who's neutral, maybe the cashier, maybe somebody you don't have strong feelings about.
Then your frenemies.
The hardest part here is, you'll think of somebody that's difficult for you to love. And maybe don't pick, the person you hate the most in the world. But somebody who's difficult to love, run through that exercise, and then you send it out to the world at large. And like training a muscle, this can feel fatiguing at first. It can feel really difficult at first, but one thing we know about the mind is that it is trainable. And so with repetition, this can be very liberating, and you can sort of settle into your equanimity and love, and can be a good way to sort of combat this.
Equanimity is the secret superpower to combat this. So you can flex in the winds of turmoil and bend and not break, like a willow tree in the wind is what I'm imagining. But should we try the loving kindness meditation on each presidential candidate sequentially right now.
I can do it right now. I will be honest. When I've guided people in this practice, and I get to the person who's hard to love, I often think of a few politicians. So it's a stretch, but it's part of the exercise.
I just imagine Thich Nhat Hanh's voice in my mind. He seems to have been the master of the loving kindness meditation and embodiment. But there's a mantra you may have heard in yoga class if you've been to a handful of yoga classes called, they say, Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu, may all beings be happy and free. And it's a nice way to, a nice intention to go out in the world with.
Yeah, I like that.
And equanimity, like you mentioned, is the stance that helps you navigate it.
I was listening to an episode of the 10% Happier podcast with Dan Harris.
Yeah, I like him.
And he introduced me to a new term. Would you call it a Buddhist term?
A mantra.
A mantra. Yeah. Tatra Majatata, which I guess roughly translates to right now it is like this, or there in the middle.
I like that.
And he kind of joked it's like the Buddhist version of Hakuna Matata. Which you could probably do a one-to-one replacement in that song with
Hakuna Matata.
Tatra Majatata.
Tatra Majatata. Yeah. And it's nice to have something like that you could recite. I like mantras for that reason. Same with the mala bead necklaces, like 108 beads and a tassel, but where people, you might be on an airplane going through turbulence and feel fear coming on, and you could have your favorite mantra in your back pocket of your mind that you bust out and be, I am safe, and do it counting the beads with your fingers silently as you go through the mantra 108 times, a magical number in like Hindu philosophy, but a very cool practical tool that I like.
Yeah, I think it's an ancient technology. I think human beings, it's not an accident that we have come up with rituals and ceremony, because we need ways to retune our nervous systems.
Might take your advanced nervous system 27 times, Steve, or whatever, but 108's a good safe bet to cover your bases.
Yeah.
Go all the way around.
I don't know about advanced. I need all the mantras I can get.
Yeah, but I think it is related to this mindful stance we've been talking about, and equanimity is a hard thing to pinpoint sometimes. And I love these different mantras and things that look at it. But when we were talking about a boundless heart, that's part of equanimity. Or I recently heard it called a divine emotion, which I really liked. Like that stance of being able to hold it all with compassion, even when things are crazy.
Yeah. A quality of what one might call the core self, or the capital S self. Yeah.
And equanimity probably encompasses a few of those 8 C's, at least.
I think so. Are we ready to move on to other tips and tricks for people to stay sane, or you got other points to make?
I'd say let's move on. I could meander forever down the conspiracy rabbit hole, because that's what you do. But it's also interesting to think about the extension of it in our work of different delusional disorders. That I find fascinating. But one maybe I'll throw in there just so we can forge ahead to what to do is, have you heard of prosanoia?
I have, but I don't remember
like
what
the
it is.
opposite of paranoia.
Yeah.
A belief that the universe is conspiring in your favor in magical ways.
Interesting.
It's kind of, it could sound cool, but we are talking about a delusion here, where you might have this tightly held, fixed false belief that fairies are sprinkling dust around to give you cookies whenever you need it on your path, something like that. But the point is like this, all of life is a spectrum, and in many, many different ways. And I think this is all, all part of the same trajectory that we're talking about. Like under intense stress, the mind can split, and it's how many of our conditions are even named in mental health. But, we all have a breaking point where things just become too much to handle or bear.
Yeah.
And one might dissociate, or one might slip into another thinking pattern. And there are some we all do on a daily basis, and there's some more extreme forms of that. And I just like to remember that personally, to keep the compassion extended as far as possible.
Yeah. I like that you're normalizing that you're putting this on a spectrum. Makes a lot of sense. So from that stance of compassion for all of us being susceptible to breaking contact with reality and retreating to dissociation or distraction, what are some ways we can navigate this insane world? We've talked about a few: empathy, loving kindness, talked about mindfulness. Do you want to riff on mindfulness for a second?
Well, I think this example we're talking about is one of the most clear-cut, practical uses of when you want to practice and bust out mindfulness out in the wild and use it. One of the most useful applications of it, like when faced with negative news, or when we notice we're caught in a doom scrolling loop that we don't want to be in, that mindful pause can make all the difference. Just having that stance of non-judgmental awareness as you go throughout your day as much as possible, and having a pause button, whatever that means for you, to bust out at any moment when you need to check in and be like, wait, why am I doing this thing, or what's going on here?
Yeah, and you might want to hit that pause button more often than not. And like I was referring to earlier, this is something that the mind can be trained to do. So a regular mindfulness practice, so the sort of as needed break glass in case of emergency mindfulness is important, but you're more likely to wield whatever's behind that glass if you practice it on the regular.
Oh, yeah. There's an extreme example from an MRI study that I just find fascinating. This was University of Wisconsin testing expert meditator monks, essentially, and non-meditators. And they exposed them to pain stimulus, like a hot metal rod that you touch on your arm. Not enough to burn someone. The ethics board had to approve this. It's a modern day
They're not searing
study. But so there was pain, and everyone felt it as part of the study. And they have brain scans so they could see what's happening in the brain, what lights up in term when you're exposed to pain. And then they told the subjects they'd be exposed to the same pain in 10 seconds. And then they were watching the brain scans. And in the non-meditators, non-practiced, if you will, the pain centers lit up. And there was a subjective report of like some suffering going on even before that happened, when in the expert meditators on the other end of this extreme, there was not. There was no unnecessary suffering they brought on by their anticipation of the suffering, because they had practiced extensively, but I think we can learn from that.
Yeah, I love it when modern technology and science confirms what ancient wisdom has known for millennia.
Yeah, we're just scratching the surface of what some of the ancient traditions have known forever, and probably chuckling from wherever they are.
Right. From their mindful pose. Wherever
in whatever quantum field they're sitting. But yeah, I like it too.
Right. Yeah, don't borrow trouble from the future. So yeah, mindfulness meditation. I guess something I would call back to basics, and this would apply in regulating one's nervous system regardless of the insane environment that you're in, but it's paying special attention to your sleep, paying special attention to your exercise, to getting out in nature and touching grass. Being around people who fill your cup and not necessarily drain it, being in positive community. I think those all things are important.
Yeah, and what you said about your nervous system and regulating, I think is another chance to take some of the things we talk about often or hear about, or therapy speak, if you will, of one's window of tolerance, and make it more practical. Like this is an example of how we should all get to know our window of tolerance at baseline, meaning with a good night of sleep, and just know that, and everyone's a little different in this regard. If you don't have a good night of sleep, that's going to narrow for most people big time. Like we can all become like a cranky baby.
Or a hobgoblin.
Even if we don't, a hobgoblin, even if we don't think we can, we don't always see it in ourselves. But I like to keep tabs on that and be like, oh, why do I feel even deep inside, unnoticeable to others, why do I feel ornery or irritable today? And there may not always be an answer, but that self-awareness, self-knowledge can go a long way, because, it can kind of be part of how you go through the day of checking in and how you navigate life when you have a bigger or smaller window of tolerance, because we all need to know and be able to use our voice and say, I need to step away from this situation now and come back to it because I'm getting flooded. We need to kind of understand what that feels like for us and in those close people around us, ideally.
Right. Yeah. Some of you have probably heard the HALT acronym. So part of that pause is, am I hungry, angry, lonely, or tired?
Yeah,
And
I like that.
If I can go feed myself, if I can get some rest, right? If I can go connect with somebody that I feel my nervous system relax around, then revisit the thing that was really bothering you, and maybe it'll have less of an edge.
Let's pause this debate and get a hamburger and then come back to it.
Yeah.
But it's true.
What debate does a hamburger not make better?
Yeah. But very real, like what could happen when your blood sugar plummets or even is far in the opposite direction.
Yeah. I mean, like to your point, if you've ever seen a toddler lose their mind, and then once they've had a nap, they're a completely different being. We're not that different. We're not that different from toddlers.
Yep. We've all done that.
I sure have.
Yeah. There's, I remember from when I was doing my MBA, this was night school during med school, so not recommended, but I remember I took an interest in this one case study that was presented of the giant telephone company, now AT&T, but it was called Ma Bell back in the day. Like in the 70s, there was a court-ordered restructuring. And this was like the biggest company in the world, like almost 30,000 employees, something like that. And then overnight, because maybe antitrust laws, I don't remember all the details. I remember the emotional takeaways, which intrigued me at the time. But this company's chopped instantly down to a bunch of parts. So it goes from 25, 30,000 employees to maybe 10, 12,000 max in these different groups. So people were shuffled all around, changing roles, and it was a time of ultimate change, and change is stressful and turmoil for many. And then this was followed over time by like all the business researchers and social scientists, and saw, what mental and physical health problems, what happened to work productivity, and this big example like that. And what some researchers pulled out of it is that those who navigated it well, like thrived in after the change, had three things in common. One of them is like, there were 3 C's, like consistency. They just kept showing up for work, kept doing those rituals that give our nervous systems a lot of comfort, which can go a long way, like just putting one foot in front of the other. We've seen it in many of our clients by whatever routine makes sense you can stick to. Next was loss of your locus of control, like whether you viewed your ability to control things as totally absent or as infinite, expansive, like a fixed or growth mindset kind of thing. And then the last was just your stance of openness to change. Like, are you a change fearing, aversive person, and that might panic at the initial first sign of change, or can you roll with it? And I think we all want to cultivate it because change happens.
Right. Yeah. So there's some certain qualities, character traits that can help a person navigate change that could be really helpful. I'm reminded of, I wish I could remember who to attribute this to, this distinction, but I heard it on an interview, but this person made a distinction between, like, when you're faced with all the troubles and trials of the world, there's a difference between what you can care about versus what you can concern yourself with. So I might care deeply about the suffering of, a group of people on the other side of the planet. It hurts me. It hits me. but perhaps I can't concern myself with it too much, especially if there's literally nothing I can do about it. So it doesn't do us or those people who are suffering any good to just torture yourself laying awake at night. Again, not that you don't want to be a good global citizen, that you don't want to be compassionate, but perhaps for the sake of our own sanity and the fidelity that we should have to the people in our circle of influence, like our family members, and that we make that distinction for ourselves. I care about it, but maybe I can't concern myself with it.
I care, but that does not concern me.
Yeah.
I like it. That could be extremely helpful, because I think there is a risk, of going after and trying to slay every dragon that ever showed up, is out there and may show up, and we could waste away while trying to do that when, maybe that's not our path.
And I will say, related to this, when you are focused on your circle of influence, getting outside of yourself and going out there and doing some good, like being of service, so that you can feel potent, like you can actually make a difference. And that could be a big thing or it could be a small thing. So when it, like you feel powerless because you're looking at the suffering of the entire world, you're not powerless entirely, and it could be as simple as actually attending to the needs of your kid instead of the 4th hour on TikTok doom scrolling. Yeah. Caring,
is action oriented, right? And there's a lot to be said about concerning yourself consciously with the things you care about and can really make an impact and have the bandwidth too.
Right.
Yeah.
Another thing I'll focus on, and we've talked about gratitude probably ad nauseum, but even if you are nauseated by it, I'm going to say it again. But just focusing on the things that you maybe take for granted, that if focused on might elevate your mood a little bit. There's plenty of great social science research that focusing on gratitude can elevate mood and increase subjective well-being. And frankly, it's funner to be around a person who is obviously grateful for the things in their life.
It is.
And it's funner to be that person too.
Yeah. It's amazing how gratitude just keeps surviving the test of time as a tried and tested strategy that makes intuitive experiential sense and is one of the most effective things we could bust out if we're just ranking tools by their efficacy, right?
Yeah. And you don't need a fancy gratitude journal. You can write them down or not write them down. Sometimes I'll just sort of sit in my house and start thinking about all the things that are awesome about modern life. Like, I'm so glad I have indoor plumbing. I'm so glad I have air conditioning. I'm so glad I have ready access to food that isn't going to poison me. And so glad I have services, emergency services. I can dial a number and a medical professional will come to my house and save my life. It's pretty incredible.
I'm so glad I have TikTok so that I can pick it up once in a while when I intentionally choose to do so and get entertainment for a moment, even though it's sticky. And I realize that.
It's actually a good point. And it brings up something else I was going to say, just introducing some discipline to your consumption of media. And that could mean deleting certain apps from your phone. It could mean there are even apps that do little screen time controls so that you don't fall down those rabbit holes.
Yeah, or
being deliberate about it.
Looking at those screen time things and like whatever your stance is, sometimes we do need to purge these things for a time to make a new habit, or sometimes we need to shine the light of awareness on it, because we weren't aware.
Yeah, it's hard to read the label from inside the jar. So sometimes it's hard to know that a lot of your distress is caused by the habits that you're in. Mm-hmm. So changing environment, sometimes I like to go on a little camping trip where I don't have access to the internet. And all of a sudden I'm like, wow, I'm more relaxed than I realized I could be. I must have been really distressed. And maybe it was because I was on social media too long or whatever. So changing the environment can bring that awareness to the forefront.
Yeah, and I mentioned this book last time, I think, by Kahneman of Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, that I'm still working through. It's a big, good book, but I bring it up again now because he talks about how he writes about how we have two kinds of minds. One is the intuitive gut reaction that can be freakishly good at detecting certain things, like he talks about how like a master chess player could be walking through a park and spot someone's chessboard and know that this person's going to end up in checkmate in 2 turns or whatever. But he's like, that's not any more surprising given, how much time they've spent in the trenches of chess than like a baby for the first time just saying dog, recognizing a pattern of things from all the things it's taken into its nervous system, and boom. So we have this good pattern recognition, but we also have bad reflexive biostats machinery or statistical. We're very prone to assume things that don't make rational sense if that makes sense. I think it's relevant here in that we might be latching on to the first easy explanation because it's there, not because it's likely.
Yeah. So slow it down.
Yeah. And we might assume that our anxiety's from this taco we just ate and not from the 7 hours of TikTok before that or whatever.
Yeah. Hopefully it's not the taco. If you ate it from Taco Bell, maybe you should be anxious, but
Taco Bell's cool these days again, Steve.
All right. Tell that to my bowels. On that delicious note, are we done playing pro tip ping pong, or do you have anything else in mind?
I would put in a shout out here for going to see the movie Inside Out 2 if you haven't.
Oh, I actually haven't seen it yet.
We should talk about it on here sometime after you do, if you do. But I bring it up because I think emotions, I'd be remiss not to put a plug for tuning into our emotions in times like this, because another example of where the rubber meets the road on the stuff we talk about here. Because at birth, we're born with this wide range of emotions and expressiveness. Like you mentioned, the kid tantrum and the kid giggles. And then over time, socialized norms, cultural repression, what happens to us in history, all the times we get hurt and suppress this and that and avoid uncomfortable things. And then we end up at a far distance from these, or with a mess of, I feel weird, and I don't know why, but looking at our relationship with emotions and doing the work on trying to identify what you're feeling and how it shows up in you can go a long way, because these are signals that evolve for just that, to help you navigate a fearful world in a good way. Like fear is there to warn, but it's there to also just be acknowledged. And so you can decide how to act on that. And they're designed to be felt, through to completion, briefly. Like the emotions rise and fall, give you information. But when we're avoiding fearing them, they can, we resist, persist, they get big, they get mixed up, and they can get overwhelming.
Yeah. I think skillful emotional navigation, skillful emotion processing is a tide that lifts all the boats.
Yeah. And then semi-related would be just something that I know has been a adult development pursuit for us both, of learning to ask for help. Like looking at what is your relationship with help seeking, and like look at some of the examples. When have I been able to ask for help? And because I really, really have come to believe that it's not only okay to ask for help, it's more of a sign of strength than weakness. If you can do that, and remembering that we are born in this world helpless babies that need care, unlike some mammal species that are born ready to run and fight. And we do have each other for a reason, and that doesn't instantly go away the time you're out of diapers. And just revisiting that. It's okay to not be okay sometimes. It's okay to ask for help. And you may also probably are doing a favor for the person, giving a gift to the person you asked to help, because we all know how good it feels to be there for someone who needs it.
Yeah, that last point was a big realization for me, that discovering that as a person who historically wasn't comfortable asking for help, that when I did, or accepted help when it was offered, that it really meant a lot to the person offering help, or the person who cares about me that I asked for help from. It is a gift.
And instead of taking this like sheepish stance of like, oh, Steve, could you maybe possibly help me with something? It's totally okay if you don't want to. I'll just assume you don't unless you tell me otherwise.
Right.
But would you help me pick up my car from the shop?
But no, never mind. Actually, never mind. Don't do it.
Oh, delete message.
Yeah.
Unsend.
Good points. Well, folks, do your best. A healthy dose of self-compassion as you do so. And may you be well.
May all beings be happy and free.
There you go. Thanks, Reid. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.